Let me start by first acknowledging that the paper I'm presenting now is based on the master thesis work of Kingsley Ajenoglu. He collected data while he did an internship at the Netherlands Railways. I was working on an assignment commissioned by Mark de Bruin of Netherlands Railways and Pim Barthemius, who worked at KIM at that time. So many of the research in literature starts from the hypothesis that conducting activities while traveling reduces the value of time. Although well-founded in theory, surprisingly limited empirical evidence is presented for that hypothesis. These are the 4 papers I'm aware of that specifically address this hypothesis. And maybe we can add the English value of time study to that. But several of those papers actually have presented unexpected findings. They find that those who work while traveling or bring an ICT device actually have a higher value of time instead of the expected lower value of time. And the likely explanation that the authors themselves discuss in the papers is self-selection. We're actually comparing 2 different groups. Those who are most time pressured come equipped. So they do not differ only on the activity they're conducting or bringing the device, but they differ on many other aspects which are not taken into account in those studies. So comparing actually between different individuals is problematic, and what we need is a within subject design approach. And actually that is already proposed by Waldman and Lyons at the end of their literature review. They say we have to observe the choices of the same persons in 2 different contexts. Either they are able to conduct the preferred activity or they're not able to conduct the preferred activity. And when they are not able to conduct the preferred activity, the value of time, according to the hypothesis, should be higher. So the difference between those value of times is actually the value which is in conducting the activity. So the value of time in the non-activity context minus the value of time in the activity context has monetary value, which we call the value of activity. But actually is the difference in value of time between those 2, measured in those 2 contexts. And obviously we have to avoid any confoundment with all other factors that could explain the difference. Such as unpleasant travel conditions, crowdedness, not having a seat, noise or other things. And we came up with the idea that we, in the non-activity context, people have to assume that they forgot to bring the equipment which they need for conducting the activity. And that obviously limits this application to appraising and valuing activities for which you need to bring equipment. So the objectives of this paper is to test this within subject design approach, to add to the evidence for the hypothesis that conducting activities while traveling reduces the value of time, and finally to provide value of activity estimates. And we think you can use them for appraising investments that are not aimed only to increase speed, but are aimed to reduce the disutility of travel on other aspects. For example, such as providing more reliable or better internet, electricity sockets for the IC devices, or silence wagons. So how did we conduct the data? What was the design of the experiment? Well, first, at the beginning of the survey, we asked people to report their reference trip. And the reference trip is the trip that people most often make while they're traveling by train. So they're all common train travelers. First, we asked them about the trip purpose of that particular trip. And we focus on commuters and leisure travelers, so not on business travelers. We ask them what is the preferred activity, so the activity they spend most time on, what they typically prefer to do while making this particular trip. And we focus on these three activities, so working, studying, reading, or listening to music, because they are mentioned by the paper of Ettema and Verschuren as the most activities that people most often do while traveling by train. And finally, we ask them what equipment they bring, what equipment they need for conducting that activity. We conducted a stated choice experiment, a very simple one. Just observe the time and cost trade-offs, keeping in mind that you make the trip for the reference trip we asked them before. And we observe the choices in both the activity and the non-activity context. We wanted to observe for a wide range of travel time and travel costs, and we decided to make three different experiments, so three different duration classes, short, middle, and long. We use the efficient design to construct the experiment, the choice sets, avoiding dominance. And so every respondent made two sets of 6 choices. And to avoid memory effects, we assigned them to different time classes per context. So that was completely randomized, and they were never assigned to the same time class for the different contexts. And we randomized the order of the activity. So some people started with the activity context, and half of them started with the non-activity context. This is how it looks like, translated to English. So on top, we summarized the reference trip, and the people, the travelers, just have to make a choice between the trade-off between time and cost. And we stress that, and this is an example of the non-activity context. No, you forgot to bring your book, paper, or something to read. And in the activity context, it says, yes, you brought your book, paper, or something to read. We invited 6,000 people from the Netherlands Rail panel. This resulted in 1,580 responses, so about a quarter. And 820, so about a bit more than half of them, are either commuters or leisure travelers. And these conduct any of the 3 selected activities, and they bring equipment for conducting that activity. So only the results are only based on this group of people. So only they were shown, presented the stated choice experiment. So the model, we only have time and cost in the choice set. So this would be the most basic utility function you could estimate. The value of time is typically the ratio of the time and the cost coefficient, which you can write differently. And that's how we used, in our models, we estimated the value of time in value of time space. As I showed you before, the value of activity is the difference of the value of time in the non-activity context minus the value of time in the activity context. So the delta value of time, which you can write differently as well. And that's how we estimated the model. So across the choices made in the activity and in the non-activity context, we estimated a cost parameter, a value of time in the activity context, and a difference in value of time between those two. And value of time in the non-activity context is just the addition of those the last 2 components. The results, so the most basic results are presented here. We estimated an MNL model for the 6 distinguished groups. I presented here the value of time in euro per minute, so I multiplied the parameter times 60. We estimated value of time in the activity context and the value of activities, which is just the difference between the two. And for interpretation and convenience reasons, I added the value of time in the non-activity context, which is just the addition of those 2 earlier values on top. So what we can see here is that indeed for 4 of the 6 groups we find significant value of time, so significant differences in the value of time between the two contexts. Not for the leisure travelers who are working or studying, a bit typical group. They are traveling for leisure purposes and still working, so this is also a very small group in our sample. And also not for the listening to music group, for the leisure travelers, also a quite small group, and they are typically more younger people, low income, so a large share of students, I would say. What we can see more that the value of activities are all larger for the commuters compared to the leisure travelers, and they are largest for those who work or study, next for those who read, and lastly for those who listen to music, which is more or less what we would expect beforehand. I also presented here the reduction in value of time, which is about the same for all the 3 commuter groups, so around 30%. The largest again for those who work or study, and the lowest for the listening to music, while the leisure travelers show some more heterogeneity. So the largest reduction is for those who read, who loses almost half the value of time. Next, we're interested whether there were any relationships with observed other variables. So I estimated a single pooled model and included all the 6 group by FX coding, which allowed me to perfectly reproduce the previous results. And I added interaction of the value of activities, the value of time in the activity context, and the cost parameter with sociodemographics, tip characteristics, and activity order. I could not find any significant interactions with gender, age, income, and education, which surprised me. Possibly the travelers are more homogeneous than expected, or they're not well represented in the data. We did not ask them in the study, but took them from the panel. Maybe that's not up to date, so that's definitely something we have to study further. That's not very well understood. We did find some effects for trip characteristics, none for how often you travel, whether you typically have a seat or not in your reference trip, whether you have to make a transfer or not, and which share of the trip you conduct the activity. But we did find for trip duration and who pays, whether they are reimbursed or have to pay by the employer, for example, or whether they pay the ticket for themselves. But for reasons of time, I did not include it in the presentation. What I did find is an activity order effect, and I will briefly talk about that. Well, if we just look at the first context people were shown, so at the first series of 6 choices, and we compare those in the activity context with those in the non-activity context, we find a difference as expected, but the difference is rather low, only 43 cents. While if we add the change shown, so the within-person comparisons, the differences are much higher. And they are highest for those who are given first the activity context compared to those which were first in the non-activity context. And I think that can be explained by an endowment effect. If you first are shown the activity context and then you take the possibility away, it feels as a loss and the other as a gain. So the first context is probably like a reference, and if you those people who are shown first the activity context feel like they own that context, the condition, and taken away is a loss. And we know from loss aversion that it has more losses have more impact than gains. The cost parameter was not affected by this activity orders, and that's what we would expect. So I think that adds at least to the plausibility of the results. So I come to the conclusions. The proposed approach okay, this is an odd version of the slides. Yeah, first, my conclusions within the within subjects approach. Yes, as I showed, I think it's important that we observe choices in the two contexts of for the same person. I think this approach works. They produce statistically significant and plausible results, and I showed you that the within subject comparison is important. So the conclusions for the value of time reduction: we found evidence for the hypothesis that conducting activities while traveling reduces the value of time. Here again a summary of the results. And finally, the conclusions with the value of activities. We think the results are plausible, and we believe that they can be used for policy implications. To those value of activities allow to appraise investments that are not intended to improve the speed, but to reduce any other disutilities from travel. And I showed you some examples before. And also in a paper by Tang et al. 2017, they wrote about, I think it was a real life case in China. They're thinking about increasing the speed of the high speed rail from 300 to 350 kilometers. And the authors say, well, the internet is not very reliable. That might be a good alternative. So I think with the value of activities, we at least have some approach where we can appraise and probably can help make this decision. And as goes for the automated vehicle, of course, they also allow conducting activities. So the value of time is expected to decrease in the future, while travel demand likely increases. So that will be a huge challenge, I think, for infrastructure appraisal in the future. I conclude with pointing out related work in our group, especially the PhD thesis work of Baiba Pudan, who focuses on time use in automated vehicles, especially in relationship to all the other activities you have to conduct in a day. And she already published a paper in which she developed a time use model along the lines as David Meunier discusses in his discussion paper. And there is a paper underway which presents the results of a focus group study. And I would like to end with a quote of one of the respondents in that focus group study who says, well, in the end you still want to reduce the time you're in a vehicle because you're actually captive by four walls in a limited space, and that relates to what Marco said before. You're not very flexible in a car, so I don't think we will arrive at a zero value of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.